In politics, buzzwords are anything but unusual, and no buzzword comes quite as often as freedom. This legislation further protects our freedom. This country is restricting freedom. However, while it's easy to use freedom in lieu of actual debate, it's a lot more difficult to actually define what it is referring to in politics, and furthermore, why we need it. Let's take a look. Freedom, by the Oxford definition, is the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants. Well, that seems pretty reasonable, apart from the fact that it's completely insane. No government on the earth provides this type of freedom. In fact, that's the very role of government. Under the Oxford definition, people have the right to rob, to rape, to murder, but the government stops this by having what is called a monopoly on violence. Essentially, only the government is allowed to restrict you and your freedoms, in order to preserve everyone's safety. Now, we all know where this can be taken. We've seen it before, most vocally in our friends at the south of the USA. Many there seem to think that freedom is a battle to be won against the government, the result usually being more guns, lower taxes, and presumably the immediate removal of all people that aren't directly descended from a boar-headed eagle. But let's not go there. Let's get a bit more sophisticated. I think we can all agree that we do not and should not have the textbook version of freedom in our everyday lives. But what then is the freedom that these politicians keep referring to? Does it even refer to anything, or is it just something to feed to voters to get them excited? Well, that's certainly a perspective to take, but I wouldn't go that far. The freedom that politicians are talking about actually refers to liberties, and contrary to what you might think, the difference is huge. Liberties are certain rights that people in a country are afforded, such as the right to freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the right to bear arms. All of these are liberties countries, particularly those in the West, afford citizens. So, when we speak about freedom in politics, we're generally not referring to the idea of freedom, but rather the liberties we construe that every person deserves in a country. Accordingly, liberties are anything but set in stone. The right to freedom of speech, for example, has certain limitations. Hate speech is a punishable offence in Australia, for example, which constitutes the use of speech to incite violence against or disparage groups of people. Similarly, America's Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is more than a little controversial, and fires up every few years after a school massacre or terrorist attack. Australia used to allow citizens guns, but after a particularly horrific massacre, chose to heavily restrict gun ownership. Whether this is good or bad depends on your perspective, but it goes to show that freedom isn't such an easy idea to rally around. This becomes even more interesting when we consider countries that don't follow Western liberties, and more intriguing further where they are successful. Consider Singapore. Under the leadership of the recently deceased Lee Kuan Yew, it flourished as not only one of the most forward-thinking, technologically advanced countries in Asia, but also the world. However, the country is anything but politically similar to the Western countries that rival it. The nation has tight laws regarding liberties we consider fundamental. There is no freedom of the press. All newspaper outlets are kept tightly under the thumb of Mr. Lee's People's Action Party. As well as this, the government is nearly impossible to remove, although Singapore uses a somewhat legitimate voting system. Freedom of speech, as any Singaporean politician will tell you, is there, technically. Rather hilariously, freedom of speech is available to all Singaporeans, but if and only if they apply for and receive a permit. And if that permit gets lost in the mail, looks like that controversial discussion about Mr. Lee will have to wait. As well as this, there is no eating in train stations, no chewing gum on the street, and a $100 fine for gambling, albeit foreigners are exempted from this one. It all sounds rather oppressive and horrible. However, the result has actually been one of the most successful political transformations in the world. Because of its harsh public eating and gum laws, Singapore is incredibly clean and efficient. The penalty for gambling has kept the local population from losing their money, yet allowed travellers from overseas to funnel money into the economy. The near certainty that the PAP will retain its office allows the government to make long-term decisions, such as the public housing system that prevents certain ethnicities from being forced into social classes. However, what democracy the country does have ensures that the PAP is generally working for the people. The country still reliably has an economic growth rate of 7% per year, and yet, by our standards, it is not free. The city-nation is one of the most diverse places in the world, with 4 national languages, English, Mandarin, Tamil, and Malay, and even as a holiday celebrating religious diversity between the Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, and Taoists, keeping the racial tensions almost non-existent. And yet, it is not free. I don't want you going away from this video with the impression that Singapore's actions are to be condoned, but I certainly do want to leave you with a state of uncertainty. So often, we think of our liberties as given, rather than as laws that are constructed by man, and forego any discussion of them as a result. To be responsible as citizens of our countries and the world, we have to recognize that our country's liberties are not the only way forward, and that it is our responsibility to decide what our liberties should be, not our constitutions. See you next time.